Picture Moscow, 1698. Snow crunches under boots, the air smells faintly of wood smoke and leather, and every man you pass seems to have a beard thick, bristling, and proud. In Russia at the time, a beard was more than hair on your face. It was identity, faith, status. For the Orthodox Church, it was practically sacred, God's own design for a man's appearance. Shaving was not just odd, it was suspicious, foreign, and even sinful. And then, one morning, everything changes. Peter I, better known as Peter the Great, just returned from his grand embassy, a long trip across Europe meant to secure allies and study Western technology. He's seen shipyards in the Netherlands, palaces in England, and the clean-shaven faces of the courts in Vienna and Paris. To Peter, those smooth chins didn't just look modern, they were modern. They represented progress, sophistication, and a Russia that could stand alongside Europe's powers. When Peter looked at his own boyars, the noble elite of Russia, he didn't see modernity. He saw relics, long coats, heavy beards, old ways. And in Peter's mind, old ways were chains holding Russia back. So, with a bluntness that shocked everyone, Peter announced a decree. If you wanted to keep your beard, you would have to pay for it. The order was brutal in its simplicity. Every man, noble, merchant, or peasant entering a city would be charged a beard tax. The fee depended on your rank. Wealthy nobles paid the most, common townsmen less, and peasants a small but still stinging amount. No money? No problem, at least not for you. The police would shave you right there in the street. Imagine it. One moment, you're walking to market, your beard swaying in the frost. The next, a uniformed man blocks your way, razor in hand. No receipt? No coin? Say goodbye to your beard, your pride, while the crowd watches. For those who did pay, there was proof. A small copper beard token, stamped with the Russian double-headed eagle on one side, and on the other, an inscription that read, "The beard is a superfluous burden." Yes, Peter made sure your license to wear facial hair came with an insult. The reaction was immediate and furious. For many Russians, this wasn't just about groomage, it was about faith. The Orthodox Church taught that shaving was tampering with God's image. Priests thundered from pulpits, warning that beardless men risked their souls. Old men wept as their beards fell to the ground. Some hid indoors for weeks to avoid the shears. Others paid the tax grudgingly, clutching their tokens like relics. Peter didn't care. In his mind, this was more than a fashion statement. It was a battle for the soul of the nation, a forced march toward the West, one chin at a time. The beard tax was his way of telling Russia, you will be modern, whether you like it or not. And for the first time in Russian history, facial hair came with a price tag and a warning that your own ruler might take it from you in public. To understand why Peter the Great went after beards, you have to understand Peter himself. He wasn't a stay in the Kremlin kind of ruler. He was restless, towering in height, full of nervous energy, always building, tinkering, or breaking something to see how it worked. He believed Russia was backward compared to the nations he'd just seen in Western Europe, and that backwardness was dangerous. In 1697–1698, Peter spent months abroad on his grand embassy, traveling incognito under the name Sergeant Pyotr Mikhailov, though his 6'8" frame and royal entourage made the disguise laughable. He toured shipyards in the Dutch Republic, studied fortifications in England, and met with leaders across Europe. Everywhere, he noticed something. The men of power, the soldiers, the merchants, none of them wore the long flowing beards so common back home. To Peter, the beard wasn't just facial hair. It was a symbol of everything he wanted to change. The bearded boyars stood for old Russia, deeply orthodox, suspicious of outsiders, and resistant to reform. The beard marked a man as someone tied to ancient traditions, a man who might resist Peter's plans for a centralized, Western-style state. Shaving, on the other hand, meant transformation. It was a visible break from the past, as clear as swapping a horse cart for a warship. When you saw a man without a beard in Russia, you knew instantly, he is with the Tsar's vision. And Peter's vision was sweeping. He wanted to modernize the army, build a navy from scratch, reform the administration, and open Russia to foreign trade and science. But those reforms needed more than laws. They needed a new mindset. And you couldn't see someone's mindset at a glance unless you could literally see their chin. That's why Peter's beard policy wasn't just about appearance. It was politics. It was surveillance. It was a public loyalty test. Pay the tax or shave, and you were signaling your allegiance. Refuse, and you marked yourself as a traditionalist, possibly even an enemy of the state. Of course, Peter dressed all this in the language of progress. He claimed beards were unclean and unfashionable, echoing European attitudes. But the truth was sharper. A beard in Peter's Russia became a kind of silent protest, and Peter was determined to stamp that out. The Orthodox Church fought back. Priests warned that shaving meant turning your back on God's law, citing the Bible and centuries of tradition. Many peasants believed the beardless looked ridiculous like children or women and mocked them. But Peter had the army, the treasury, and the law on his side. By turning beards into taxable property, Peter made every man's face a political statement. From the Kremlin to the smallest market stall, you could tell at a glance who had submitted to the Tsar's new order and who was still clinging to the old one. The beard tax was only the beginning. Soon, Peter would find more ways to force Russia into a Western mold, and resistance would turn from grumbling to open defiance. Once Peter the Great issued his decree, the next question was practical. How do you actually put a price on facial hair? Peter's solution was part bureaucracy, part street theater. The beard tax wasn't a flat fee, it was scaled by class. The wealthier you were, the more you paid for the privilege of keeping your whiskers. Here's how it broke down. Nobles and military officers, 600 rubles a year, a crushing sum enough to bankrupt a minor landowner if ignored. Merchants and townsmen, 100 rubles, still painful, but survivable. Peasants entering a city, a smaller, one-time fee, just a few kopecks at the gate. Coachmen and traders, somewhere in between, depending on their income. Once you paid, you received prufa, small copper or silver token known as a beard token. One side bore the Russian double-headed eagle, the other carried the inscription, "The beard is a superfluous burden." It was both receipt and humiliation. Carrying one marked you as someone willing to pay for what Peter saw as an outdated decoration. Lose your token, and you risked being stopped and shaved on the spot. Enforcement was aggressive. City police and even soldiers patrolled markets, gates, and main streets, checking for tokens. If you didn't have one, there were two options: pay on the spot or have your beard forcibly removed then and there. Eyewitnesses reported scenes where proud old merchants were pinned to a bench, while an official scraped away years of growth with a straight razor, their protests drowned out by jeers or sometimes cheers from onlookers. Naturally, people tried to dodge the tax. Some grew shorter beards, hoping to pass unnoticed. Others carried fake tokens or bribed officials. Peasants sometimes entered cities through side paths or riverbanks to avoid the gate guards. In a few cases, men wore false chins or glued on whiskers to protest in secret, shaved in public, bearded again in private. But Peter anticipated resistance. In 1705, he tightened the law. Any man found bearded in public without a token could be fined on the spot, and repeat offenders could face arrest. The message was clear: this wasn't a passing fad. The beard tax was here to stay. It wasn't just about money. The very act of paying kept the issue in people's minds. Every time you handed over rubles for your beard, you were reminded that your appearance was the Tsar's business. It made your face into a public ledger of loyalty or rebellion. For many, this was infuriating. Beards were personal, religious, cultural, and now the state claimed the right to trim them at will. For others, the tax became a grim badge of defiance proof. They were willing to pay dearly to keep tradition alive. As the law spread, the beard became more than hair, it became a battleground, and the fight was just beginning. If Peter the Great saw the beard as a barrier to progress, the Orthodox Church saw it as a wall built by God Himself. and you didn't tear down God's wall for fashion. In Orthodox tradition, the beard wasn't just a style, it was a divine command. Many church fathers taught that shaving was a rejection of the natural image God gave man. The book of Leviticus was often cited. Ye shall not round the corners of your heads, neither shalt thou mar the corners of thy beard. In other words, don't touch the beard. So when Peter decreed his tax in 1698, the church hierarchy erupted. Patriarch Adrian, head of the Russian Orthodox Church at the time, openly opposed the law. From pulpits across the country, priests warned that shaving was a sin, a mark of vanity, and a dangerous slide toward foreign heresies. The sermons were vivid. Shaving was compared to disfiguring your soul. Beardless men were mocked as women in trousers or children in men's clothes. Some priests even claimed the angels would not recognize a beardless man at the gates of heaven. The logic was simple. If God gave you a beard, who was the czar to take it away? For ordinary believers, this put them in an impossible position. Obey the czar and risk your salvation, or obey the church and risk public humiliation or worse from the state. Families split over the choice. In some villages, groups of men swore oaths never to shave, no matter the penalty. Peter ignored the outrage. To him, the church's resistance was proof of its stubbornness, and breaking that stubbornness was part of his larger plan. He was already reducing the church's political power, reorganizing its administration, and bringing it under state control. The beard tax became another way to show that spiritual authority now bowed to the throne. The result was open hostility. Priests refused to bless clean-shaven men. Some excommunicated parishioners who shaved. In extreme cases, men who returned from cities without their beards were treated like strangers in their own homes, shunned until they regrew their honor. There were rumors, never fully proven, that some church communities hid men with beards from tax collectors, smuggling them in and out of towns under cloaks. Others quietly pooled money to pay the tax for poorer parishioners, treating it as a kind of religious duty. But Peter had the one thing the church lacked: armed enforcement. And while priests could threaten your soul, soldiers could seize your beard right there in the marketplace. The standoff between Tsar and church over the beard tax wasn't just about hair, it was about the shape of Russian power. For centuries, religion had dictated public life. Now the state was asserting itself in the most visible way possible, right on your face. And Peter was far from finished. His war on beards was just the first volley in a broader campaign to tear down old Russia and rebuild it in a new Western mold. Peter the Great didn't just write laws about beards, he took razors into his own hands. Multiple eyewitnesses record a startling habit. When Peter saw a man with a beard he didn't approve of, he didn't wait for a tax officer. He would pull out a razor or even a pair of scissors and shave the man himself, right then and there. It wasn't symbolic politeness either. Peter was quick, firm, and completely unapologetic. Foreign envoys, court officials, and even high-ranking boyars found themselves cornered by a 6'8" czar wielding a blade and a smile that was half amusement, half challenge. The first recorded incident happened soon after Peter returned from his grand embassy in 1698. At a gathering in the Kremlin, he shocked the court by suddenly ordering several noblemen to step forward. Before they could react, Peter snatched a barber's razor from a servant and began shaving them one by one. Witnesses recalled the awkward silence broken only by the scraping of hair on steel and Peter's booming laugh. For Peter, this wasn't cruelty, it was theater. A public demonstration of who held authority in Russia. Every stroke of the blade was a stroke against the old ways. When the Tsar himself cut your beard, there was no doubt left about your position in his new order. You were under his hand. It wasn't just nobles who fell victim to Peter's impromptu barbering. Foreign diplomats reported seeing him shave merchants at ports, military officers on parade, even random men in the streets of St. Petersburg, especially if they were arriving from the countryside and still carried the old Russia look. One English traveler described Peter as in such high spirits at the sight of a beard that he must needs remove it himself. Another diplomat called it a kind of royal sport. But for the men on the receiving end, It was anything but playful. Being shaved without consent in front of your peers was humiliating, a public mark of submission. This personal approach served Peter well politically. It made his beard policy impossible to ignore. If the Tsar might appear at any moment and take the razor to you, you either paid the tax or shaved voluntarily. It turned compliance into self-preservation. Of course, there were risks. A man's beard could be bound up with his faith, his masculinity, his family's honor. To have it taken by force was a provocation, and Peter was lucky that none of his clients decided to defend their facial hair with a dagger. But Peter thrived on pushing boundaries. The danger was part of the thrill. By shaving people himself, Peter sent a clear message. No part of Russian life, not even your own face, was beyond the reach of the state. And soon, he would expand his campaign beyond beards, targeting the very clothes people wore. Peter the Great didn't believe in half measures. If you were going to look like a European, it wasn't enough to shave your beard, you had to dress the part. Within months of launching the beard tax, Peter issued another decree. Traditional Russian clothing for men was out. Gone were the long, heavy kaftans and flowing sleeves favored by boyars for centuries. In their place, Peter demanded Western-style coats, breeches, and waistcoats, the kind he'd seen in the courts of England, France, and the Netherlands. The reasoning was the same as with the beard. Long robes and ornate belts marked a man as a creature of the old Muscovite order. Shorter, fitted garments meant mobility, practicality, and above all, modernity. They also showed off the clean-shaven chin Peter was so determined to promote. Enforcement worked much like the beard law. Guards stood at city gates and palace entrances checking clothing. If you wore traditional garments, you could be fined on the spot. In some cases, tailors were stationed nearby to cut off the excess length of your robe whether you agreed to it or not. This reform hit people just as hard as the beard tax. Clothing was deeply tied to identity and status. Nobles displayed their rank through the richness of their fabrics, the width of their sleeves, the length of their coats. Cutting them down was not just about fashion, it was about stripping away symbols of prestige. Peter's own court became the model. He appeared in tailored European coats, knee-length breeches, silk stockings, and polished leather shoes. His inner circle followed suit, and soon the court glittered with lace cravats, feathered hats, and gold-trimmed cuffs. But outside the palace, resentment simmered. Peasants saw the new clothing as foreign and impractical for Russian winters. Merchants resented the expense of replacing perfectly serviceable robes with imported styles. The Orthodox clergy saw the changes as yet another intrusion of Western heresy. To them, Peter wasn't modernizing, he was dismantling holy tradition. Some tried to compromise. Men would wear European coats in the city but slip back into their kaftans at home. Others had tailors subtly modify old robes so they looked modern enough to pass inspection, but still retained familiar patterns and folds. Peter wasn't fooled. In 1701, he tightened the regulations again, specifying exact styles and lengths. He even imported foreign tailors to work in Moscow and St. Petersburg, ensuring that Russian men couldn't hide behind local interpretations. The connection between the beard tax and the dress code was obvious. Together, they created a complete visual overhaul of Russian manhood. A clean-shaven chin framed by a stiff collar, European cuffs at the wrists, polished shoes on the feet was an image Peter wanted burned into the world's mind when they thought of Russia. To Peter, this wasn't about vanity. It was about optics, diplomacy, and proving Russia could match the courts of Europe in refinement. But to many of his subjects, it felt like an irrational law at a time of everything they had been. And resentment, as Peter was about to learn, could be just as dangerous as any foreign enemy. You can shave a man's face, shorten his coat, and fine him until his purse is empty, but you can't tax away resentment. Almost as soon as Peter's beard tax and clothing laws took hold, quiet resistance began to spread. It wasn't the kind of open revolt that made headlines in the capital. This was subtler small acts, whispered defiance, the kind of opposition that could slip beneath the Tsar's watchful eye. In rural villages, where state patrols were rare, men simply ignored the laws. They kept their beards, wore their kaftans, and laughed at stories of city folk being shaved in public. In market towns, sympathetic gatekeepers might forget to collect the beard toll from friends or fellow parishioners. Some resistance was crafty. Merchants who traveled to the cities would arrive with clean-shaven chins, their beard tokens in hand, but once home they'd grow their whiskers back. For them, shaving was just another cost of doing business, no more meaningful than paying a road toll. Others carried fake tokens, forged in back-alley workshops by craftsmen who made their living selling counterfeit proof of loyalty. A few took defiance further. In the Volga region, there were reports of men wearing false beards over their shaved chins as a kind of protest performance, mocking the Tsar's decree by flaunting obviously fake facial hair. In St. Petersburg, rumors swirled of secret beard clubs, where members gathered to drink, trade news, and show off their carefully maintained beards away from the public eye. The Orthodox Church quietly supported much of this underground resistance. Priests blessed beards in special ceremonies, framing them as sacred shields against the creeping influence of Western heresy. Some church communities even created hidden funds to pay beard taxes for poorer members, keeping them in compliance with the state while preserving their religious duty. But Peter's agents were everywhere. Police raids on markets sometimes uncovered caches of fake tokens. Traveling merchants were stopped on the roads, inspected for stubble, and fined for letting their beards grow between visits. Tailors who modified old-style robes into hybrid garments risked losing their licenses or worse. The punishment for open defiance could be brutal. Repeat offenders might have their beards shaved in public, accompanied by jeering crowds, or be paraded through the streets as examples of stubborn ignorance. In rare cases, fines piled so high that families lost property or were forced into debt. Still, the underground held firm. For many Russians, the beard tax had become more than a grooming lot, was a symbol of identity under siege. To keep your beard was to keep your dignity. To pay the tax was to acknowledge the Tsar's reach but not his right. The more Peter pushed, the deeper this quiet resistance rooted itself. And while it would never topple his reign, it ensured that the beard tax remained one of his most hated reforms, talked about in taverns, whispered in churches, and remembered long after the razors were put away. But Peter wasn't just changing faces, was changing cities. And nowhere did his Western vision take sharper shape than in the swampy marshland that would become St. Petersburg. If Moscow was the old heart of Russia, St. Petersburg was Peter the Great's freshly carved, clean-shaven face. In 1703, Peter began building his dream city on the marshy delta of the Neva River. The location was harsh flood-prone, mosquito-ridden, and bitterly cold in winter. Thousands of laborers, including soldiers and conscripted peasants, were forced to work in brutal conditions. Many died, but Peter didn't care. He wasn't just building a city, he was building a statement. St. Petersburg would be Russia's window to Europe, and through that window, the world would see a nation remade in the Western Imagino beards. No flowing robes, no trace of the Muscovite style Peter wanted to bury. From the beginning, appearance in St. Petersburg was not a private matter. The city was planned with wide, straight streets in the European style, perfect for military parades and public inspection. It was easier here for officials to spot violators of the beard and clothing laws than in the winding alleys of Moscow. Guards were stationed at major intersections, stopping men to check their chins and their coats. For Peter, this wasn't just about enforcing the tax. It was about creating a self-policing culture. In St. Petersburg, you couldn't blend into a crowd of bearded men in kaftans. The city itself was designed to showcase and enforce Western vision. Foreign architects and artisans were brought in to design palaces, government buildings, and even ordinary homes in the style of Amsterdam and Paris. These imported workers, almost all clean-shaven, became walking advertisements for Peter's reforms. Russian nobles who wanted property in the new capital had to adopt European dress and grooming if they wanted to be part of high society. This created a kind of visual divide. In Moscow, you could still find plenty of men with beards and traditional robes, especially in the older quarters. In St. Petersburg, those same men stuck out like a sore thumb. Some were fined heavily just for walking down the street. The Orthodox Church had less influence here too. The city's religious life was kept firmly under state control, with no room for the kind of open defiance that flourished in rural parishes. Peter personally ensured that the clergy stationed in St. Petersburg were either sympathetic to his reforms or too cautious to challenge them. Over time, the city became a living portrait of Peter's ideal Russia. Nobles strode through the streets in tailored coats, their chins bare, their hats trimmed in the latest European fashion. Merchants conducted business in imported cafes and salons, not smoky wooden taverns. Even the common laborers were more likely to be shavdif, only because the state insisted on it. By creating a capital where the beard tax wasn't just law but culture, Peter gave his reforms a showcase. St. Petersburg was the face he wanted Russia to present to the world: disciplined, modern, and unmistakably Western. But back in the heartland, the old ways still thrived and resentment toward the beardless city was growing. By the early 1700s, Russia was starting to look like two different countries, one clean-shaven and strutting down the wide avenues of St. Petersburg, the other still wrapped in kaftans and clutching its beards like heirlooms. In the countryside, Peter's reforms felt far away, until they didn't. Rural Russia was deeply tied to the Orthodox Church and suspicious of anything foreign. For generations, beards had been as natural as breathing, and most men had never seen a noble without one. When word spread that the Tsar's new city was full of beardless men in strange, tight clothes, the reaction was part disbelief, part disgust. Travelers from St. Petersburg were mocked as half-men or foreigners in Russian mouths. Some peasants crossed themselves when they saw a clean-shaven noble muttering prayers against evil spirits. In taverns, stories circulated that shaving led in sickness, or worse, made you infertile. But this was more than superstition, it was politics. In rural villages, the beard tax was a symbol of the growing gulf between the rulers and the ruled. The nobility in St. Petersburg seemed like a different breed. They spoke foreign phrases, drank imported wine, and followed strange customs. For the bearded heartland, these were not signs of progress, they were signs of betrayal. Merchants traveling between city and countryside felt this tension firsthand. In St. Petersburg, a clean chin was a ticket to respectability. In a rural market, it could make you a target for ridicule. Some traders carried false beards to wear on their journeys home, avoiding awkward questions from customers who trusted a man with whiskers more than one without. The resentment had economic roots too. Peter's reforms, including the beard tax, hit peasants and small towns hard. Every kopeck paid for a beard was a kopeck not spent on grain, tools, or clothing. Worse, fines for non-compliance could push a family into debt. Meanwhile, the nobles in the capital seemed to have endless funds for French lace and Italian shoes. The Orthodox clergy kept the anger alive. In village churches, priests preached that St. Petersburg was a city of sin, a place where holy tradition was mocked and foreign vice flourished. Some even claimed the clean-shaven nobles were servants of the Antichrist, sent to lead Russia away from God. Peter didn't ignore this divide, but he didn't back down either. If anything, he leaned into it, pulling the elite closer to his vision, while letting rural Russia stew in its resentment. In his mind, the future was in the cities, and the countryside would either adapt or be left behind. That gamble worked in the short term, but it planted seeds of distrust that would last for generations. For many in rural Russia, the beard tax wasn't just a strange policy. It was the moment the ruling class stopped looking like their people, in every sense of the word. And Peter's court, full of polished chins and powdered wigs, was about to double down on its transformation. Peter the Great didn't just want his court to look different, wanted it to be different. The Kremlin's old ways were gone. In St. Petersburg, every nobleman, courtier, and foreign envoy entered a space where the rules were written in lace cuffs and bare chins. Attendance at court was no casual matter. If you were summoned, you were expected to show up dressed in the latest European fashion. Tailored coats, breeches, stockings, polished shoes, and absolutely no beards unless you could produce your beard token. Even mustaches were scrutinized, with Peter favoring neat, clipped styles over the thick, sweeping whiskers still popular in the countryside. The transformation was immediate to anyone who stepped inside the gilded halls. Gone were the bearded boyars in heavy brocaded caftans. In their place stood men who looked like they had walked out of Versailles or Amsterdam. Powdered wigs became fashionable among the highest ranks, not because Peter ordered them, but because they completed the European look he valued. This visual shift was deliberate. Court gatherings were full of foreign ambassadors, military advisors, and merchants. Peter wanted them to see Russia as an equal among European powers, disciplined, stylish, and unmistakably modern, and nothing signaled that faster than a noble class that looked the part. But the beard tax loomed over every social interaction. If a noble appeared without a beard but clearly hadn't paid for one recently, it raised eyebrows. Was he avoiding the tax? Was he letting stubble grow between inspections? Peter's court thrived on spectacle, but it also thrived on gossip, and a man's chin could be a political liability as much as his words. Peter himself set the tone. He was a towering figure, broad-shouldered, energetic, and perfectly willing to correct any mistakes in appearance he spotted. Stories circulated of him pulling courtiers aside mid-event to adjust their coat buttons or tug at their cravats. If he thought your beard looked too long, he wouldn't hesitate to comment or have it trimmed on the spot. Court events became both a stage and a test. Balls, banquets, and state receptions were opportunities to display not just wealth, but loyalty to Peter's vision. A well-dressed, clean-shaven noble was signaling obedience. One who clung to old styles, even subtly, risked being marked as resistant to reform. For some, this was thrilling. Younger nobles often embraced the changes eagerly, seeing them as a way to advance quickly in the Tsar's favor. Others, especially older boyars, endured them grudgingly, their resentment hidden behind polite bows and carefully chosen words. The court became a kind of living advertisement for Peter's Russia own he could display to the world. But it was also an echo chamber, far removed from the reality of villages where men still crossed themselves at the sight of a beardless face. Outside the palace walls, the beard tax was a burden. Inside, it was a badge of belonging, and in the years ahead, that split would only deepen. If Peter the Great's beard tax was the law, the beard token was its receipt and its reminder. These tokens were small, round pieces of copper or silver, usually about the size of a modern coin, and they were your license to keep the hair on your chin. Lose it, and you risked losing the beard itself. The design was unmistakable. One side carried the Russian double-headed eagle, the emblem of state power. The other bore an image of a nose, lips, and a tuft of beard, sometimes with the inscription, "The beard is a superfluous burden." It was part proof of payment, part propaganda. Every time you pulled the token from your pocket to show an inspector, you were forced to read that message, reminding you that the Tsar himself saw your beard as unnecessary, something you were clinging to out of stubbornness or superstition. The tokens varied depending on the class of the owner. Wealthier men, who paid higher annual fees, often received silver tokens. Lower classes were issued copper. Peasants entering the city for trade might pay just once, receiving a temporary token valid for that trip alone. The material in your hand wasn't just a marker of compliance, it told anyone who saw it where you stood in the social order. Carrying the token was an exercise in vigilance. Officials and soldiers could stop you at any time to demand proof. A missing token could mean an on-the-spot shave, a fine, or both. For merchants and travelers, this meant keeping the token on their person at all times, tucked in a pouch, hidden in a coat lining, or even worn on a cord around the neck. But the tokens also became symbols of quiet resistance. Some men wore them openly, almost like medals, a way of saying, "I've paid, but I'm still keeping my beard." Others treated them like holy objects, passing them down to sons or hiding them as keepsakes long after the tax ended. Forgery became inevitable. Blacksmiths and metal workers in market towns learned to copy the design closely enough to fool a quick inspection. These forgeries were risky to carry being caught, with one could mean harsher punishment than simply failing to pay the tax. Still, for some, the risk was worth it. Surviving beard tokens are rare today, partly because they were small and easily lost, but also because many were melted down for their metal. The ones that remain are strange artifacts, coins that weren't currency, emblems of a law that policed a man's face. For Peter, they were more than receipts. They were tools of control. By making men carry physical proof of their compliance, he turned the beard tax into a daily reminder of his authority, something you could feel in your pocket and know, without a doubt, that even your beard belonged to the state. And yet, as visible as the tokens were, they were only part of the machinery keeping the beard tax alive. The real force came from the men tasked with collecting those payments and keeping razors sharp. Peter the Great's beard tax didn't enforce itself. It needed eyes, hands, and razors on the ground men who could stop you in the street, demand proof, and, if necessary, remove the offending hair right there in public. In cities like Moscow and the freshly built St. Petersburg, that job fell to a mix of police officials, gate inspectors, and even soldiers on patrol. They weren't just collecting a fee, they were upholding the Tsar's personal vision for Russia's future. The system began at the gates. Anyone entering a major city could expect to be stopped. Inspectors would scan your face first, no questions asked. If they saw a beard, they'd demand to see your token. No token? Out came the tax ledger, and you paid on the spot. Couldn't or wouldn't pay? That's when the real drama started. Accounts from the time describe how inspectors would bring out a portable shaving kit, a straight razor, a leather strop for sharpening, a basin of water, sometimes cold, sometimes boiling hot, depending on the inspector's mood, and a rough cloth. They weren't barbers, and their technique showed it. Some shaved quickly, others hacked away with little care, leaving the victim with cuts or patches of stubble. And there was no privacy. Shaving was done in full view of whoever happened to be nearby. Crowds often gathered, some laughing, others crossing themselves in sympathy. For a proud man, especially an elder, it was public humiliation of the highest order. Inside the cities, street patrols kept the pressure on. Markets were prime hunting grounds, places where rural traders with untaxed beards were easy to spot. Patrolmen would weave through the stalls, checking faces like merchants check goods. If they caught you without a token, you'd be fined or shaved before you could sell a single turnip. Some inspectors developed reputations. Merchants whispered about certain beard hunters who were especially zealous, always on the lookout for the faintest shadow of stubble. Others were more lenient, willing to accept bribes or look the other way if you knew the right handshake. But the most feared encounters were with Peter himself. The Tsar had no problem acting as his own enforcer, and everyone knew it. If he spotted a beard he disliked, whether on a lowly clerk or a high-ranking official, he might seize the nearest razor and take it off personally. In those moments, there was no argument, no appeal, and no time to produce your token. For the enforcers, the job was both a source of income and a dangerous post. They were dealing with a law that cut straight to personal pride and religious conviction. More than one inspector walked away from a confrontation nursing bruises or worse. Still, the shaving squads kept at it. Their work made the beard tax visible, unavoidable, and feared. Without them, the tokens would have been just another forgotten decree. With them, the clean chin became a public badge of obedience. But the same zeal that kept the system running also fueled the resentment that would make the beard tax one of Peter's most infamous legacies. Peter the Great was many things: reformer, warrior, shipbuilder, but above all, he was a man who counted the cost. The beard tax wasn't just a cultural hammer, it was meant to be a financial tool as well. In theory, taxing something as universal as beards should have been a goldmine. Every man in Russia who wanted to keep his facial hair had to pay, from wealthy boyars to peasants just passing through a city gate. Peter expected the revenue to help fund his modernization projects, especially his costly dream of building a navy from scratch. The rates were steep for the elite. Nobles and military officers, 600 rubles a year. Merchants and townsmen, 100 rubles a year. Peasants entering cities, a small daily toll, often just a few kopecks. For perspective, 600 rubles could buy hundreds of acres of land or feed a village for months. It wasn't just a fee, it was a financial chokehold on the nobility who clung to their whiskers. On paper, this looked like easy money. In practice, collecting it was a nightmare. Rural evasion was rampant. Some nobles quietly shaved between inspections, skipping payment entirely. Peasants slipped into cities through back roads, avoiding the gate tolls. Forged beard tokens flooded the black market, reducing official revenue. Even when payments were collected, the system was costly to run. Inspectors had to be stationed at every major gate and marketplace. Tokens had to be minted, patrols paid, and when confrontations turned, violent damages settled. More than one city report complained that the expense of enforcement swallowed much of the profit. Still, the tax did bring in steady income, especially from urban centers. Merchants, who needed to enter and leave cities regularly, often paid without complaint, at least outwardly. For them, it was simply another cost of doing business, like road tolls or market fees. But Peter's motives went beyond money. Even if the treasury gains were modest, the beard tax achieved what he really wanted: a visible daily reminder of his power. Every man who reached into his pocket for a beard token was reminded that his own face was subject to the Tsar's will. That said, the economic burden added fuel to the resentment. For the poor, even a small toll was a blow to survival. For the wealthy, the high annual fees felt like punishment for loyalty to tradition. Over time, the tax became less about its price in rubles and more about its cost in pride. And Peter wasn't done squeezing his subjects for both. As his wars expanded and his reforms grew more ambitious, the beard tax became just one line in a long list of ways the state could reach into your pocket and your life. Peter the Great didn't just change Russia. For Russian, she changed how the rest of the world saw the country. And nothing caught foreign attention faster than his sudden assault on the national beard. When diplomats, merchants, and travelers arrived in St. Petersburg or Moscow, after 1698, many were stunned by what they saw. Those who had visited before noticed an immediate difference. The once beard-filled streets were now dotted with clean-shaven faces, especially among the elite. And the men who did keep their beards had a peculiar habit, producing little copper or silver tokens from their pockets like passports for their chins. Western Europeans often approved. In their eyes, Peter was bringing Russia into the modern fold. A French envoy wrote home praising the Tsar's civilizing measures, saying that without beards, Russian gentlemen now looked more like Christians and less like Asiatic barbarians. Dutch merchants, who already enjoyed Peter's enthusiasm for shipbuilding and trade, saw the beard tax as proof of his determination to align Russia with Europe's fashions and business practices. But not everyone was impressed. Some visitors saw the reform as heavy-handed and culturally tone-deaf. English traveler John Perry, who worked for Peter on engineering projects, admired the Tsar's ambition, but admitted that forcing men to alter their countenance by law was bound to cause unrest. The Venetian ambassador described the policy as a strange tyranny upon the visage of the people. Foreign merchants were sometimes caught in the crossfire. Bearded traders from the Ottoman Empire, Persia, and Central Asia, who considered their facial hair a sign of dignity, were shocked to learn they would be taxador shaved upon entering Russian cities. For Muslim and Orthodox visitors alike, the policy was baffling and at times deeply insulting. In fact, for Russia's eastern and southern neighbors, the beard was an important diplomatic signal. Envoys from these regions often kept theirs as a matter of protocol. Peter sometimes granted exemptions to foreign dignitaries to avoid offending allies, but ordinary travelers rarely enjoyed the same courtesy. What struck many outsiders most was Peter's personal involvement. News spread quickly in diplomatic circles that the Tsar himself sometimes acted as the enforcer, razor in hand. The image of a ruler shaving his subjects and occasionally foreign guests became both a curiosity and a warning. In Russia, even your face was not your own. For some, the beard tax confirmed Peter's genius. For others, it confirmed his reputation as a ruler who mixed brilliance with a streak of authoritarian eccentricity. Either way, it made an impression that Europe would not forget. And Peter's beard war wasn't just being talked about abroad. It was starting to seep into art, satire, and rumor at home, shaping how Russians remembered it even while it was still happening. Russians have never been short on humor, even when the punchline can get you in trouble. The beard tax, with its mix of absurdity and humiliation, became a ripe target for underground satire almost as soon as Peter announced it. In taverns and tea houses, jokes began to circulate. A man without a beard is like a bread without a crust, soft, pale, and fit only for the Tsar's table. Another popular quip claimed that Peter shaved men not to make them modern, but to use their whiskers as stuffing for his wigs. It was nonsense, of course, but the image of the towering Tsar wearing a beard-filled hairpiece was too funny to resist. Cartoon-like sketches, illegal but secretly passed around, mocked the policy. In one, Peter was drawn as a giant barber, chasing tiny boyars across the steppe with a razor. In another, nobles held up their beard tokens as if they were holy icons, worshipping them while Peter laughed in the background. Songs and rhymes carried the satire further. Some were clever enough to pass for harmless folk tunes, their political bite hidden in wordplay. Others were openly defiant, sung at gatherings far from the ears of city inspectors. A few verses mocked the new European fashions too, comparing the nobles' tight breeches to sausage casings and their lace collars to doilies stolen from grandmothers' tables. Even the Orthodox clergy used wit in their resistance. One priest, when told to shave to set an example, reportedly replied, "Tell the Tsar that, if God wished me to be hairless, he would have made me a chicken." Of course, open mockery was dangerous. Satirical sketches could earn a man a beating or a fine. Songs could land a tavern under suspicion. But humor was a release valve, a way for people to push back without outright rebellion. The state, for its part, tried its own propaganda. Official notices framed the beard tax as a step toward cleanliness, civility, and European dignity. Pamphlets depicted bearded men as ragged, dirty, and backward, while the clean-shaven were drawn as healthy and well-dressed. In the new capital, public murals sometimes featured idealized images of beardless soldiers and shipbuilders, presenting the look as part of Russia's bright future. But satire had a way of outlasting official art. While Peter's propaganda faded with time, the jokes stuck, passed down in oral tradition, retold with new twists. For generations, Russians would recall the beard tax not just as a law, but as a strange, slightly ridiculous chapter in their history, proof that even a ruler as great as Peter could pick a fight with the hair on your face. And as the years passed, the policy itself would begin to change, reflecting both the Tsar's shifting priorities and the public's stubborn endurance. By the later years of Peter the Great's reign, the beard tax had become less of a shock and more of a stubborn fact of life, hated, mocked, resisted, but also woven into the rhythms of daily existence. In St. Petersburg, it was simply part of the city's identity. Officials and soldiers still patrolled for violators, but enforcement was less chaotic than in the early days. Merchants budgeted for the tax like they did for road tolls. Nobles who refused to shave had long since decided they'd rather pay than fight. The drama of public shavings became rarer, replaced by routine inspections. But in the countryside, resistance remained steady. In many villages, the beard tax existed mostly on paper, an occasional nuisance when traveling to a market town rather than a constant burden. Some rural officials quietly ignored enforcement, figuring there were bigger problems than chasing whiskers. Others enforced it zealously, but only as a way to line their own pockets with bribes. Peter's own focus began to shift. His later years were dominated by the Great Northern War against Sweden, the building of St. Petersburg into a true imperial capital, and the expansion of his navy. While the beard tax still mattered as a symbol of reform, it was no longer his personal crusade. The Tsar, who once chased boyars with a razor, now spent more time in war councils than in impromptu barbering. After Peter's death in 1725, The fate of the beard tax fell to his successors. Catherine I, his widow, and later rulers kept the tax in place, but without Peter's force of personality, enforcement became patchier. In some reigns, inspectors were strict. In others, the law was barely noticed outside the capitals. The tokens kept circulating, but they became less feared, more a bureaucratic nuisance than a political weapon. Over time, the clean-shaven look stuck among the elite, not because of the tax, but because fashion had shifted. Younger nobles had grown up in a Russia where beardlessness was normal, even stylish. For them, the beard tax was just an old formality, like paying a small fee for hunting rights. Still, among the lower classes and in the Orthodox Church, the beard remained a point of pride. The tax never erased the tradition entirely. It only deepened the sense that keeping a beard was an act of cultural loyalty. By the 18th century's close, the beard tax was fading into the background. It lingered in law books, still occasionally enforced, but it had lost the sharp edge it had under Peter. The razors were put away, the confrontations forgotten, and the token once dreaded began to be tossed in drawers or melted down for their metal. What remained was the story. The tale of the Tsar who declared war on beards would be told for generations, half in awe, half in laughter. It became a symbol of Peter's reign, bold, intrusive, and unrelenting, but also eccentric, even absurd. The beard tax had started as a revolutionary statement. By the end, it was a reliquon, more quirk, in the long, tangled history of Russia's road to modernity. Today, more than 3 centuries after Peter the Great first ordered his countrymen to bare their chins, the beard tax survives only as a historical curiosity, a strange footnote in the story of Russia's transformation. Yet its echoes still linger, not just in museums, but in the Russian imagination. Modern Russians learn about it in school as one of Peter's more eccentric reforms, often alongside his shipbuilding feats and military victories. In popular culture, it's remembered with a mix of admiration and amusement. Admiration for the Tsar's unshakable will, amusement at the idea of a ruler chasing nobles with a razor. It's hard not to smile at the sheer audacity of it all. Actual beard tokens, rare survivors of the policy, are now treasured artifacts. A few are displayed in museums in Moscow and St. Petersburg, their inscriptions still clear. The beard is a superfluous burden. Collectors paid dearly for them, not for their metal value, but for the story they carry. Holding one is like holding a fragment of a time when your chin could be taxed as easily as your land. Historians see the beard tax as a microcosm of Peter's rule, ambitious, authoritarian, and deeply symbolic. It wasn't just about grooming, it was about control, identity, and the power of the state to reach into the most personal corners of life. In that sense, the beard tax was less about the hair and more about the face Russia would present to the world. The Orthodox Church's resistance is remembered too. In some religious circles, Peter's beard war is still cited as an example of secular authority overstepping spiritual boundaries. For traditionalists, it's a cautionary tale about rulers who try to cut away more than just customs. And yet, the beard never truly vanished from Russian life. From 19th century writers like Tolstoy to modern hipsters in Moscow cafes, it has reappeared again and again, sometimes as fashion, sometimes as faith, sometimes as quiet rebellion. If there's a final lesson in Peter's beard tax, it's that you can change appearances quickly, but you can't shave away identity so easily. The razors may have been sharp, the tokens official, the fines heavy, but beneath it all, the beard endured. In the end, Peter won his battle for a westernized elite, but the beard won the war for the Russian soul.